Good morning and welcome to Talking Transitions. My name is David Marchick and I'm the director for the Center for Presidential Transition. We all woke up to shocking news this morning. So before we get started, let me send our best wishes for a speedy and complete recovery to President Trump, the First Lady, as well as all the officials who work closely with the President. 1 month out from November 3rd, Americans across the country have already started voting in the most important presidential election in a generation. President-elect Joe Biden or re-elected President Donald Trump will face a double-digit unemployment situation, a global pandemic, a reckoning on racial inequality, and a divided nation. The one institution that can help address these problems is the federal government. And the federal government needs to be effective if it's going to deliver for the American people. That's why preparation and planning today is critical for effectiveness on January 20th. Regardless of who wins, a smooth transition this year is not enough. This year we need the best transition ever in American history. Should Vice President Biden win, the challenges are just truly daunting. In normal times, a new president faces mammoth tasks, a 78-day period to form a government, select more than 4,000 political appointees, manage an almost $5 trillion budget, and roll out an ambitious policy agenda. That's in normal times. But today, it's not normal. In addition to the normal challenges I just mentioned, the next president will have to get 13 million people back to work, distribute 330 million vaccines, and bring our country back together again. Should President Trump win, the transition will also be incredibly challenging. Our data from the last 3 two-term presidencies suggests that almost half of the top officials across the government leave within 6 months of the second inauguration. Half. That's a normal churn rate. But it unfortunately comes on top of more than 133 senior positions that are currently vacant without an incumbent or without a nominee. So a huge challenge for a re-elected President Trump will be attracting competent and qualified people to serve. Preparation, as we've learned on our podcast Transition Lab, is essential in year 4 for year 5. If there's a change in administration, the outgoing president will also have a solemn responsibility under law to facilitate a smooth transition, much as President George W. Bush did for incoming President Barack Obama. Transitions are always hard. They're chaotic. The time is short, 78 days this cycle. And if the election's not decided on November 3rd, there will be even less time. Getting ready for day 1 will become more difficult because every day will matter. That's why this event, Talking Transitions, comes at such an important time. We're pleased to be hosting this first event of its kind, a nonpartisan event in association with the truly amazing presidential libraries for the past 4 presidents, the George and Barbara Bush Foundation, the Clinton Presidential Center, the George W. Bush Presidential Center, the Obama Foundation, and also the UVA's Miller Center, the leading research center in the country on the American presidency. Thank you all for your incredible support, partnership, and collaboration. Our work at the Partnership for Public Service has never been more important. For 4 presidential cycles, we've worked to make transitions better, smoother, and faster, because the success of a presidency is directly correlated with the success of their transition. And throughout this cycle, we've worked with the 3 most important actors, the Trump White House, the career officials across the government who are preparing for either eventuality, as well as the Biden team. Now, we have thousands of people watching this event. The largest group represents the dedicated career agency officials tasked with transition planning under the law. They must prepare for either eventuality, a re-elected President Trump or a new President Biden. We realize how hard and how delicate your work is every day. And we're here to support you, and we salute you. Now, I want to thank a few people before handing it over to former Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker. Max Steyer heads the Partnership for Public Service. He's been an advocate for more effective transition planning before anybody else focused on it. Second, the Center has a truly world-class advisory board, one that I've benefited from sage advice, counsel, and support. My longtime friend Mac McClarty, President Clinton's first chief of staff. Josh Bolton, President Bush's chief of staff, who I call the godfather of smooth transitions. Governor Mike Leavitt, who led the Romney transition planning effort. Now, Romney didn't win, but Mike created a new gold standard for transition planning. And Penny Pritzker, who's one of the few people I know who's been equally successful in business, in government, and with her philanthropy. Let me also thank the amazing teams at the Partnership, at the libraries, and at the Miller Center who have pulled this event together. With that, let me turn it over to Penny Pritzker. Penny?
David, thank you very much for that very gracious welcome. Let me begin by wishing the President and the First Lady a speedy recovery. David, you have been a tremendous leader of this vital project, and we are so grateful that you have dedicated your time and your energy to this important effort for the benefit of our nation. We're also so very grateful to your dedicated team at the Center for their long hours to support us all. The timing of today's conversation could not come at a more critical point for our nation. Given the weight of issues we face, both candidates will not only have to campaign vigorously, they also need to prepare to run the country for the next 4 years. The diverse and sizable audience we have today reflects the interest people have in a presidential transition, even if the process is not well understood. We have people from Capitol Hill, private industry, good government organizations, transition subject matter experts, political appointees, those who served on campaigns and transition teams, and the media. We also welcome the many federal career professional staff joining us this morning. Your expertise, institutional knowledge, and willingness to support administrations from both parties during a presidential transition and over the life of each administration is to be commended. And we are sincerely very grateful for your public service. Let me just say, as a person that came from business into government service and who was given the honor of a lifetime serving in President Obama's cabinet, I was blown away by the incredible talent, expertise, and innovative spirit of the career professionals, not only in the Department of Commerce, but across the entire government. Quite honestly, some of the most capable people I have ever worked with were the career professionals in the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Bureau of Industry and Security, the Census Bureau, the National Weather Service, and so many more important offices within our government. Day in and day out, they do this significantly important work on behalf of all of us. And frankly, they get too little credit or respect for it. So I want to thank them all. In terms of our event today, the caliber of our speakers is a testament to the nonpartisan convening power of the Partnership for Public Service and their vital work to make our federal government work better. And it demonstrates the impact of the Center's ability to provide support, expertise, and resources to a wide variety of groups that are transition stakeholders, including federal agencies, political appointees, and presidential transition teams. The Center brings unparalleled capacity to support presidential transition planning and execution. Their work has gone deeper and had a broader than any other cycle with the three main stakeholders: the administration, the federal officials responsible for transition planning, and the Biden transition team. Well, I am honored to serve as co-chair of this critical effort, along with Mac McClarty, Josh Bolten, and Mike Levitt, three simply extraordinary public servants who I am blessed to learn from and call my friends. As David said, today's program is a one-of-a-kind event that draws together a highly respected group of senior officials from every administration, from Bush 41 to Obama, presidential scholars, and respected journalists. It illustrates one of the most important of our democracy, our commitment to the peaceful transition of power. The purpose of this event is to inform the public about how presidential candidates, transition teams, and the federal government are critical to the success of a new or for a president's second term. By design, we do not have representatives from the current administration, given our desire for each discussion to remain nonpartisan and to the extent practical and non-political. In our first panel, Margaret Brennan, Face the Nation moderator and senior foreign affairs correspondent at CBS News, will moderate a conversation with Josh Bolten, Andy Card, Dennis McDonough, and Mac McClarty, four outstanding former White House chiefs of staff. They will talk about their experiences preparing to take office, transitioning to a second term, planning to leave office, and what to expect in 2020 and 2021. Melody Barnes, former director of the Domestic Policy Council, will then lead a discussion with Stephen Hadley, Lisa Monaco, Barbara Perry, and John Podesta about transitions and crises, and why this transition period could be the most important and consequential since 1932. Let me say one thing about John Podesta. He has more senior transition experience than probably any other living person, and could have been on the first panel. And in fact, we asked him to be on the panel with chiefs of staff. But on reflection, we and John thought that given his experience in the 2008 transition, where he led the Obama transition during a financial crisis and two wars, he would be hugely value-added on the second panel, entitled Transitions in Crisis. And that may be perhaps the most relevant topic for today. For our final panel, Amy Walter, national editor of the Cook Political Report, will talk with four incredible public servants: Alexis Herman, Valerie Jarrett, Karen Hughes, and Margaret Spellings, about the complexities involved with the shift from campaigning for the presidency to governing when elected, in either a first or second term. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us today and for your many excellent questions. We hope to get to them as best as we can throughout the morning's program. You can also be part of today's conversation on Twitter by following @PublicService and by using the hashtag #TalkingTransitions. So now I'd like to hand the program over to Margaret Brennan for our first panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Secretary Pritzker, to David Marchek, and to the partnership for all of the nonpartisan work that you do to explain to the public how the institutions that support our democracy function or are supposed to function. This is an extraordinary morning. I think all of us have woken up to this news with a little bit of shock. And the one certainty of 2020 seems to be that nothing is certain and to expect the unexpected. So I think this is a really fitting conversation today to have this powerhouse set of minds who have been inside the West Wing at the very highest levels to help talk us through what planning needs to look like, what it should look like, and what it is like in a moment of crisis. We are, of course, battling multiple crises as a country right now: economic, health, racial strife, election uncertainty, and now this news this morning. I want to start by digging in right away to this conversation with the chiefs. It's going to be a question for all of you, which is, we are 4 years into the Trump administration. Are they ready? Is Mike Pence ready for what is happening right now? Mac McClarty, could you start us off? If you were chief of staff, what would you be doing on a morning like this?
Well, Margaret, first of all, I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you for your engagement in helping underscore the importance of presidential transitions on a nonpartisan basis. I'm delighted to be with my fellow chiefs. And Dave Marching, thank you for your leadership. And Secretary Pritzker, you set the table just perfectly, as you always do. Margaret, I think all of us as chiefs of staff would agree the vice presidential pick decision is an important one during the campaign, and then when you shift from that campaign to governing, the criteria for a vice president is he or she needs to be ready to step in if it is a moment that requires that, and be able to discharge the responsibilities as Commander-in-Chief, President of the United States. So clearly, that is really from day one an absolute essential ingredient or element of any effective administration. So if I were chief this morning, you would be focusing on that. You would certainly be fully engaged with the president and his family in this time, and you would, as always, as Dennis and Andy and Josh will comment on, you would have a multiple number of other issues that would be inevitably confronting you, even in times that were not quite as unprecedented and unsettling as these.
Let's go to Andy Card. You know what it is like to be chief, to be in that job in a moment of extreme national crisis. What do you do on a morning like this?
Well, first of all, our prayers are with the President and the First Lady, and I don't care what your political stripe is or what your philosophy is or bias may be. We all pray that the President and the First Lady will recover quickly and be able to meet their responsibilities. I also point out that the White House has to keep everything working no matter what's going on. So the first responsibility for a chief of staff is to make sure that people in the White House have the confidence to be able to do their job and give them permission to do their job, and not try to jump into somebody else's lane or be distracted by current events or distracted by the president's inability to attend meetings that he normally would attend. So just having discipline, I think, and confidence and a steady hand makes a big difference. It's also important for the chief of staff to maintain the momentum that every cabinet member has been asked to maintain with regard to the policies and the objectives. I would leave the campaign work to the campaign people. I would not, as a chief of staff, I would say my job would be to help the government meet its responsibilities and let the campaign worry about the campaign responsibilities. But it is not an easy time. The truth is, as Max said, it's a time when you actually have to be prepared for the more unexpected things to happen. And these unexpected challenges are likely to show up, and we want people to have confidence in our government, confidence in our democracy. And I do view it's the White House responsibility to maybe set the expectation up so that people will have confidence that their government can function during these times of trouble.
But Josh Bolton, I mean, we are seeing a public that is riddled with anxiety right now and questioning so many of our institutions. Now what would you be doing if you were chief? Do we need to, as members of the public, see the president coming out today? What do you need to signal to the public today?
Well, you need to signal to the public that government is operating officially, normally, naturally, and if the president's available, sure, put him on camera as well. Let me add my own best wishes to those of my colleagues for the First family, and thanks to the Partnership for Public Service, the Presidential Foundations, and you, Margaret, for bringing us together on this important topic. And I think the topic just gets more important when we face a disruption, a potential crisis like we're having right now. In a sense, it's kind of a dry run for what we may be facing around election day.
I want to get into some of the specifics around Election Day in a moment, but I do want to give Dennis McDonough a chance here to jump in and give his take on what do we need to hear from the president today, from Joe Biden perhaps even, what needs to be signaled, and if you were chief, what would you be doing?
Yeah, Margaret, thanks a lot, and again, want to thank my fellow chiefs for the chance to be with them. I always enjoy that. I want to thank David and Penny for all their work at the partnership, and especially this timely event today. Look, the first and most important thing is what Vice President Biden has said today and what each of the three chiefs has said. And you started with, Margaret, which is that our thoughts and prayers for a speedy recovery for the first family go out, obviously, and that express our ongoing appreciation for that medical staff inside the White House, which has obviously been working overtime since last January when this news first broke. Look, I think demonstrating that the government is at work is really important, hopefully reassuring to the American people. I think that was really what was behind the written communication from the White House doc, the White House chief physician overnight. And obviously, it does sound to me like the White House is talking about trying to get some very clear evidence of the president at work today, and that would make sense to me. I just add one thing to the points that my three colleagues have already made, which is that we do have troops all around the world right now. We have allies all around the world, and I would expect to see communication not only with the cabinet, as everybody's already referred to, but also communication from the White House to our allies. That obviously work continues here, official business continues here, and that will be obviously prudent as well as careful about the developments with the first family, but also continue to be focused, as Mac, Andy, and Josh have said, on the official business of the government, and that includes staying vigilant with our allies.
We know this morning the president is symptomatic, though from our reporting, it is mildly symptomatic at this point. That question of how ill he becomes, is this something that we frankly hope to learn more about, and is, as you point out, potentially a national security crisis because of this question of confidence. Josh Bolton, I want to go back to you on something that you raised in your first answer. We as a country, because of this high anxiety, are asking so many questions about basic civics of how transitions work, of how the election is going to work, and the details are so key and so important because of this unprecedented circumstance in which the next election will be happening with this global pandemic. Given your observations of the campaign and the transition planning that is happening behind the scenes, how confident are you? What concerns do you have about a transition either into a second Trump term or potentially into a Biden administration?
Well, Margaret, the good news is that I think everybody should be comforted at the kind of work that's going on in both places to prepare for a transition. Obviously, that work is much more substantial and intense with respect to a potential Biden presidency, but they like other campaigns before them, not all, but most campaigns in recent times have taken the transition very seriously. They have an excellent team in place, and I think they are likely to be well positioned to take over, despite the difficulty in with the potentially multiple crises that they will be inheriting. I saw that firsthand in 2008 and 9 with the Obama transition, which was run by one of your next guests, John Podesta. Very professional, very well organized, a good partner. And I think we're seeing the same thing from the Biden team. So on that side, it's good. And but we also know that the Trump White House is taking their responsibilities seriously, and they're of course hoping and planning to remain in power going through. But I hope they're also treating it as an opportunity to refresh and reset as needed.
You're talking about the mechanics of the process behind the scene, led by Chris Liddell and others on the team there, transition-wise. We know the president's remarks have raised and brought this into the public space as a conversation of what a transition might look like. And to that point, Dennis, can you pick up on that? We are expecting, or told to expect, a litigated outcome to this election. We won't have clarity for potentially days, maybe weeks after November 3rd. We know that just based on the amount of time it will take to tally up the record number of mail-in votes that are expected. How concerned are you about these circumstances and what influence they could have on a transition?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Margaret. Obviously, prudence dictates that everybody take this period of transition very seriously. The fact is, as Josh has just briefed through, I think the institutions, that is to say, the transition team at the Biden campaign, the transition team that there's been some reporting on inside the White House just over the course of the last couple of weeks, as you said, run and appears by Chris Liddell. But then, as importantly, as David and Penny teed up at the start, the senior civilian federal workforce who have mobilized and organized and prepared for a transition in either case, that is to say, into a second President Trump term or into a first President Biden term. All those wheels are moving and moving quite effectively, as near as we can tell. I think it's important to, in the context of your question, to just highlight one thing that I think President Obama always thought, that this transition period is important for two reasons. One, there's only one president at a time. So when there is a change, it's important that the current president runs through the tape into January 20th. But it's also important, and this is the second point, that the current president recognized that the transition, an effective transition, and a clean handoff to his successor is also part of the job description of and the definition of an effective presidency, especially in the times of the kind of crisis that we're living in. And so I hope that informs the ongoing work of the transition team inside the government, as I know it will among the federal service. And then I hope it informs the decisions that the president makes, as you suggest, in the days leading up to the voting and then coming out of the voting. The institutions are strong. They work. Josh, that's how Josh started his comments a minute ago. I have every confidence that they'll work again. But again, we have to understand, and I hope the president and his team understand, that the definition of an effective president starts also with the job description that includes the transition, clean handoff, especially in a time of crisis.
Andy Card, back in 2000, we saw a contested outcome, as you well know, and because of what happened in Florida, that delayed the transition period. It certainly delayed clarity for a long period of time. What was the net effect of that? And how do you see that as a potential parallel to an outcome we may see come November?
Margaret, thank you for that question. Thank you for your leadership in this conversation. Yes, that was a challenge. However, it was also a blessing. I got to spend time with the president-elect that we didn't even know was the president-elect at his ranch in Crawford planning what kind of government he wanted, while Secretary James A. Baker III and Joe Alba from the campaign were managing the recount and the question of hanging chads and dealing with the lawyers and everything else. We were focused on building a White House staff first and a cabinet second. And the president and I, or the president-elect and I, had a wonderful time kind of working under the radar screen, because most people were focused on what was happening in Florida. We could spend time getting to know each other very well, having me understand what his priorities were, not just in policy, but also into his relationships with people on the White House staff and in the cabinet, and going through names and kind of building a White House staff without the expectation every day of having to talk to the press. And so that was a blessing. But we did leave the question of who won up to Jim Baker and Joe Alba and the folks that were working on that. Josh Bolten was focusing on the policies that we would want to have as our first priority when we took office on day one, and that happened to be education reform. And we also had Joe Hagan, who was already working to help make sure we had the infrastructure of organizational support at the White House in order to get things done. A lot of people don't recognize there were kind of two transitions. One transition is truly a White House transition, and that's where the president has immediate impact on putting somebody into a position. He can say, in the morning, I want John Smith to be on my staff, and in the afternoon, he shows up. With the cabinet, you have to make sure you go through a process of informing the Senate and giving them a chance to ratify that decision. So there are two transitions. One is of the White House to get ready for the real transition into governing, and then the transition into governing. And I was blessed to have the experience of an uncertain election result, to spend more time organizing the White House staff than you normally get to do. And some presidents have suffered because they didn't get their White House staff organized until the end of the process. And it's really better to have it done at the beginning of the process. But the team that the president-elect put together, starting with Jim Baker, Joe Alba, and Karl Rove, and Karen Hughes, and Josh Bolten, and Joe Hagan, really helped make a big difference in having the White House ready to help the rest of government understand the priorities of the new president.
And Josh, can you pick up on that, Josh Bolten? Because we just heard some of the positives, but there were complications because of the delay as well. Those were pointed to in the wake of the 9/11 attacks and the abbreviated transition and some of the negative impacts that may have contributed to problems within the administration. Practically speaking, how complicated does it become in these circumstances?
Well, let me add one point to what Andy just said, which I completely agree with all of it. And there's one thing that we kind of took for granted that's very important in this circumstance, which is that we had two candidates who were prepared to live by the adjudicated result of the election. And this goes back to what Dennis said right at the outset, which is it's crucially important that in what could have been a severe national crisis because of the ambiguity in election results coming out of Florida in 2000, could have been a big crisis. We had two candidates who told their staffs, we will live by the legal outcome here. We will live by the result. And both candidates, before the Supreme Court ruled in mid-December, both candidates made it clear to their entire teams that we'll fight this as hard as we can through legal means, but once that string is out, it's out, and whoever is declared the winner is the winner. And that's what's crucially important. So the mechanisms that we've been talking about are all extremely important, but the leadership comes from the top, and the two candidates need to go into this, what could be a delayed or ambiguous election result on election day. They need to go into it with an attitude of country first.
Well, some of the mechanics may be complicated by a delayed or abbreviated transition, but Mac McClarty, can we pick up on that idea that Josh Bolton just raised here, which is, yes, there are mechanics, yes, there are institutions here, yes, there is a plan for a transition, but some of what underpins all of this is that assumption of comedy, that assumption that the rules will be played by and abided by. Are you concerned that that won't happen this year?
This is a highly unusual election year, Margaret, by any standard, with the pandemic and with the way this campaign is taking place. And there clearly are concerns with how the voting process is going to be conducted. The president has raised that. There's been countless news articles, as you and everyone following the election knows full well. But, Margaret, the hallmark of our democracy and any working democracy is a peaceful transition of power after a free and fair election has been conducted. I mean, that's at the very core of our democracy since our founding fathers gave us the Constitution and a republic if we can keep it. So there's no question that we, each of these chiefs of staff will comment, administration that had a handoff to the next administration did so with after the campaign, which is always vigorously contested, and that's putting it diplomatically, particularly in this year perhaps, in this campaign, but had a real transition, a real spirit of cooperation. And the most sacred responsibility, Margaret, as you so well know, for any commander-in-chief is the safety and security of the American people. So it's just essential in a transition that you have a not only a peaceful transition, but a smooth transition from one administration, in some cases from one party to another. We all benefited from that in our transitions as chiefs of staff. I hope and pray that we see that this year as well.
You hope and you pray. What do you think happens on that constitutionally, laid out date of January 20th?
Well, I hope, first of all, that the election, which is going to be a different election, Margaret, for sure. I don't think anyone has a perfect crystal ball. When you hear people that you really respect, including the chairman of the Federal Reserve, using the words unknowable, that gives you some indication of the uncertainty that we're living and working in, as you've already noted as you began your opening comments. But what you hope is that there is a clear understanding and acceptance of the election results, and then from that, I think you start to move forward with the transition. That's the real question.
Dennis McDonough, you were supposed to be involved in then President-elect Obama's first intelligence briefing after the election, that PDB briefing. And I'm told by our David Marchik and his team of researchers that the CIA was under instructions to only brief President-elect Obama and no one else. Do you know what happened during that meeting, that briefing? I mean, it occurs to me in a year when we have so many national security crises and issues confronting the next commander-in-chief that the sharing of intelligence and a conversation like this is going to be of extreme heightened importance.
Yeah, thanks, Margaret. That's not my recollection, and so maybe I should talk to David, but I remember sitting with President Obama on the morning that he had his first briefing. In fact, I remember it because I had been in Chicago for an extended stay, and my wife and I had very young kids whom I hadn't seen in some time, and I came back home to see them and my wife, and had hoped to be able to stay there, but then was directed to turn around and go back to Chicago to join the president for the brief. So, but you're absolutely correct that the sharing of the intelligence is maybe one of the most concrete examples of the kind of sharing that needs to happen across the board. And to Josh Bolton's good credit, in 2008 and 2009, that happened. And so my participation with the president on that PDB is an example of that, but it's only one of several examples, and many of those examples that Josh set, I tried to emulate then 8 years later in November, December 2016 and January 2017. And I guess I want to go back just 1 second on your earlier question, Margaret, because I feel like we're not giving you the answer that you want, which is, are we worried about the transition? The short answer to that is yes. Each of us was in that job because we're worriers. If you're not a worrier, you won't qualify for this job. But I guess what I also want to communicate as clearly as I can is that there are, as you noted in my answer, institutions at work right now to ensure that we're ready for a variety of eventualities. And individuals will be making decisions in the context of the election result. Nobody has suggested that the results will be inaccurate. People have suggested that the results will be perhaps delayed because of the numerous vote by mail opportunities. So if there were an effort to curtail the counting of people's votes, yeah, I'd be worried about that. But I think the current team has to understand that the first judgment on a great presidency will be whether you run through the tape and fulfill the job responsibilities of being president. And one of them is a clean, effective handoff, particularly in a time of crisis. And I believe because of that, individuals will make the right decisions. Let the votes be counted so that American people have confidence that the way they vote gets counted and it gets counted accurately. And we'll continue this now more than 240-year tradition of peaceful transfers of power.
Thank you for your clarity. That is a question that the public is asking quite a lot these days, whether the date of the election, whether the date of the transition, whether some of what the president has said publicly, practically, actually could be implemented, which is why I asked it. Let me pick up on what you just mentioned, which was that you were part of briefing the Trump incoming team and the Trump administration. They went through a few iterations, as we know. What did you do to help prepare them, and what effect did your attempts to do so have? Were the efforts well received?
Well, look, I hasten to add one thing at the start, which is I did several things, but so did hundreds, if not thousands, of other people. And so the wheels that are turning right now, especially on as Penny and David said at the start, with the federal service, are substantial. And they're preparing for either eventuality, and that's a big amount of work. So yeah, I did some things, but most importantly, the government did a lot of things. One. Two is there were two big challenges in 2016. One was the wholesale change of the transition team right after the election, which delayed, I think, the Trump team's start of the transition, which is the transition itself is very short if you compare our transition period to other countries around the world. So anything that curtailed it even more is unfortunate. The other thing is that that slowed down the building of their team, and it appears, not necessarily from my firsthand knowledge, although I have some of that, but from a lot of reporting, including by Michael Lewis and others, that a lot of the material that was prepared for the transition team just wasn't consumed. Now, time will tell whether that is, what the overall impact of that is. But the fact is that it was a delayed start. It does appear that the prepared material was not consumed, even though it had been prepared. And it looks to me like the Biden team right now, as Josh suggested a couple minutes ago, is learning from that and is really digging in on these questions. And I think that gives me great hope in the context of a very tumultuous period.
Josh Bolton, why was it so important to President Bush and your team to create the model that both you and Dennis have talked about?
The most important thing is that we were in the midst of two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and particularly at the time when we began to start thinking about the transition, which, by the way, is a lot easier to do if you're a second-term president than a first-term president. But there we were approaching the end of a second term. In 2007, the situation in Iraq and Afghanistan was not particularly good. The country remained under physical threat, and in early 2008, President Bush called me into his office, and he said, "This will be the first transition in modern history conducted when the nation is actually under threat, and I want it to be the best and most effective possible, regardless of who wins." It came from the top. There were a lot of good people in government doing their jobs, but it really came from the top, with the president setting the tone and saying, we're partisans. We want the Republicans to win, but the transition is a moment for country first, and that's especially true in the midst of a crisis.
Andy Carr, we are also looking at the possibility of the transition simply being from term 1 to term 2 for the Trump administration. What do presidents need to do in year 4 to be preparing for year 5?
Well, first of all, they have to acknowledge that there is a transition. So you're not just taking yesterday and repeating it. And the people sometimes feel that they shouldn't be replaced. So they want to hold on to the desk, even though the president wants them out of office. So I remember, first of all, President Bush was also ready to have a very good transition should he have lost re-election. So he had told us to be prepared to transition to another president. So he was, as Josh said, he was just as focused then on the responsibilities of being a leader of our great democracy as he was being, yes, I'm the president. And he was prepared to pass the baton if he had to. I do remember meeting with him the Thursday after the election at Camp David. And he called me into his office and said, "I'm going to make a number of changes in the staff, in the cabinet, and I'm going to make some changes." And he told me the cabinet agencies that he wanted to change. And I said, "Well, that's wonderful. You should probably start with your chief of staff, because that will send a signal to everybody in government that there may be new people coming into your position." And he said, no, I need you to help me make those changes. And this is a side story. I said, "Well, you got to go talk to my wife. I'm not sure that I can put up with it for that much longer." And he said, "I'll go ask her right now." He jumped up and went out and saw my wife and says, "Kathleen, Andy says that he can't do this if you don't agree." But he wanted me to help make changes. And one of the challenging aspects of the chief of staff is you really don't get to hire people. You do get to tell people their service is no longer needed. And that's a very tough thing to do, especially the cabinet members who feel that the president won re-election, therefore they should keep doing their job. So changing people is part of a transition, a friendly transition from Team 1 to Team 1 plus, and that's what you have to do. So yes, there was a transition, even though the government quote was the same. President Bush was the same president on January 19th as January 21st. But he did have a new government as the executive branch to make his new policies and momentum what he wanted. He had a lot of things he wanted to finish and get done, so we focused on that. And we had an honest transition, and it made a big difference. I thought that the second term started off very, very well, considering we were in a war and we were dealing with unbelievable challenges. But he was able to get an awful lot done.
Mac McLarty, what do you think needs to happen year 4 for a year 5? And how do you continue to recruit good talent to come into an administration for a second term?
Well, building, Margaret, on what Andy has said, I think he outlined some of the tenets of a change there to a second administration. I think so importantly is how the campaign has gone before that then re-elected that president. In President Clinton's case, he was the first Democrat to be re-elected since Franklin Roosevelt. So I think critically important is for the country to feel that the reelected president, leader, has a vision, a renewal moving forward, and not just really resting on the laurels or being stuck, so to speak, or at least slowed with that first term. It's got to be a renewal, a new vision. I think as far as the leadership and people are concerned, Margaret, I think there is a natural transition there, whether it be the chief of staff position. John Podesta has been mentioned. I think each of President Clinton's chief of staff really served, including Leon Panetta and Erskine Bowles, at times that they were well suited for. And I think the same goes for the cabinet. So, and the ambassadorial corps as well. So I think there's a natural renewal there of new people. It's got to be done, however, in an orderly, smooth, thoughtful manner, purposeful manner.
But how do you, I guess, Josh and Dennis could weigh in on this too, the question of turnover, the question of being able to recruit good talent. David Marczyk started us off with that statistic that almost half of senior leaders in administration depart in the first 6 months of a second term. What is the practical impact of that, and how do you recruit good talent? Josh?
It's hard, but Andy did a good job, and it's a challenge throughout a second term. But it has to be done, and for the transitioning administration, I agree with Andy. The risk is not so much that you won't be able to find good people to replace the people you've had. The much bigger risk for a second-term administration is that you won't realize that this is a good time to replace people and reset. And everything about an administration makes people feel like they're in place and they deserve to be there, but they need to be reminded what Andy Card reminded the Bush White House staff of regularly, is that we are tenants, not owners of this place. And we need to keep it fresh. We need to keep energy, and then we need to be prepared to leave when the time is up, and therefore use every day you possibly can. By the way, Margaret, it actually gets harder on the recruitment side. Gets harder the later you go into a second term. I took over from Andy in year 6 of the Bush administration. And when it was time for a new Treasury Secretary, it took me several months to persuade Hank Paulson to agree to take the job, because there were only 2.5 years left in the administration and what was there to do. It turned out that may have been my biggest contribution to government, which was
pretty key selection at a key moment.
Yeah, because we ended up in an economic crisis right at the end of the administration, which Hank Paulson had a lot to do with basically rescuing the world economy. And so I think of it less as a transition problem, but an ongoing problem of how do you keep the staff fresh? How do you get the best people into government? And by the way, don't ever assume that if you've only got a year or 6 months, there's nothing to be done. Margaret, you started it out exactly right by saying, expect the unexpected, especially now.
Mm-hmm. And Dennis, I mean, we've had already tremendous turnover just in these 4 years of the Trump administration. Do you have concerns, and what is your advice for a second term in recruiting top talent?
Yeah, look, I think, am I concerned? Absolutely. I mean, that's the lifeblood of an administration, is the people that you're able to bring in, and that you're able then to work with the federal service, which is so, as Josh was saying earlier, is so plumb full of massive talent. And so, yeah, talent is a principal challenge, I think, in that bridging from the end of a first term into the new second term. But I want to just underscore, and I believe this, I think, mostly because this is among the really good pieces of advice that I got from all the former chiefs, including several pieces from Josh. This was the best piece of advice that he gave me when I took the job, which is that you have to be very intentional about and very focused on this question of keeping talent, but also then being very clear-eyed when you need to move off of existing talent into new talent. So you got to be constantly looking for signs of fatigue in your team. You got to be constantly taking care of your team, but then you also have to be constantly looking for new talent because you're going to need it. And so intentionality is really important. And let me just say one thing here, which is I think how the how the Congress and how the Senate handles confirmations is an issue in this, both as it relates to how quickly you can get your team on the field and some of the kind of tomfoolery that comes along that delays that. And moreover, some of that tomfoolery kind of reaches such a level that you end up losing an opportunity to get really good talent on the field because they're dissuaded. So I said that was my last point, but it's my penultimate point, because here's my last point. The last and most important point is there's massive strength in diversity. And part of that diversity is mixing in new team with your old team. But part of that diversity is making sure the country looks like America. And you see this now in the Biden campaign. You see it in the Biden campaign promises that he wants to build a team that reflects the full gender and racial diversity of the country. And I think that will have, and look, I think each of the three chiefs that are on here similarly tried to build their teams. So that has a great virtue all its own. How that team works well together, how it reflects the strength of the country, that has a self-reinforcing impact over time. And so the fact that they're starting with such a focus on this gives me great hope.
Mac McLarty, should we be more hopeful that was it tomfoolery? Was that the term you used there, Dennis? Some of the problems of actually getting people through and confirmed the thousands of jobs that require confirmation, that changes? Or are we in a point as a country where we are just so incredibly partisan that the sand is in the wheels, and that it will be complicated for whomever is elected, unless they have a majority?
You raised the right question. I think it shows how much times have changed, Margaret. I believe I have my facts correct. We had all of our cabinet in place in the Clinton administration the day after inaugural, save one, the Attorney General, which was our mistake on the vetting. In a Republican Senate, they cooperated with that confirmation process. Most of the tomfoolery was avoided. So we had all of our cabinet in place, save one, and it's important, Margaret, and I think particularly relevant today. Stuart Gerson, whom Andy and Josh remember well, was the acting Attorney General, and we could not have asked for better cooperation from Stuart or General Gerson, until we got our Attorney General Jan Reno in place. That's how it was then. It's very different now. But boy, do the American people ever want Washington to work much better. Hopefully that will prevail. But it's harder also, Mark, going back to your recruiting point earlier, I think it's harder to recruit people to serve in government now than it was perhaps 10, 20 years ago. I don't think there's much doubt about that.
Well, perhaps coming out of this chime in?
Max Steyer has actually worked very hard to call attention to the challenges of confirmation. And I believe that he has had an effort to try to reduce the number of people that actually need to be Senate confirmed, which would get rid of some of the tomfoolery that takes place on Capitol Hill.
One other of the many complications out there is the fact that having in-person conversations is complicated these days, not even talking about actually holding congressional hearings in person. What about on the practical side with remote work and the fact that this is a question from one of our audience members, it's likely to continue through 2021. What hurdles will it present remote work for the Office of Presidential Personnel when it comes to recruiting talent? Anyone want to take that?
I'm happy to jump in the breach here. I mean, I think this is going to be a new challenge kind of across the board. And I think that, at least in my experience, as long as you're, as you know, Josh was suggesting a minute ago, intentional about finding the talent, and as long as you're clear and candid about the kind of team that you're going to run and the process that you're going to run with that talent, it's not hard to get people to stand up and come in. The Senate business kind of notwithstanding, I guess. And so this new remote work is kind of I think that's going to be what we're going to be dealing with kind of across the board, not just in a transition federal government, but in all the other things that the American people are dealing with now.
One of the challenges of the Zoom process is that it's very hard to build a culture of support from the workers and the team members. And so I think that's, when you're working at the White House, the offices are really quite small, and it is an intimate place to work. So it's very easy to have an impact on the way people work, the culture that they kind of bring to work. It's going to be more difficult to do that if we have to do everything remotely. And so I think motivating people to feel as if they're part of a team is challenged because of the distant relationship that we now have to have in so many different aspects. And it's not just in government, it's throughout corporate America as well.
I would add quickly to that the White House, particularly if it's a new administration, you've got new people coming in. It's not like an existing organization like you have in business or professional organizations where you know people, you work with them. So when you have remote work, you still have that bond of connectivity and familiarity. Now, in certainly the Trump administration and the Biden administration, if it comes to pass, people have worked together in the past, and that will be a real plus. And I think, finally, Mark, picking up on your point, I do think this is such an important, challenging time. Hopefully, it will call people to public service in terms of recruiting talent and leadership.
Josh, I have a question for you on the national security front. The United States has just demonstrated to the world that we may have some of the best healthcare systems. Our commander-in-chief is the most protected man in the world, arguably with access to tremendous medical care, yet he is vulnerable to this virus. We as a country have demonstrated to our adversaries that we are vulnerable to a public health crisis. Are you concerned on day one in a transition what that could mean in terms of an immediate national security threat for the current or the incoming president?
I am, and it's not something to be panicked about, but it's definitely something to be worried about. It's actually what animated President Bush in 2008 to tell me we've got to do the best transition in history because the country's under threat. And to your point, Margaret, there is no greater moment of vulnerability than that day of the transfer of power, or even just the few days as the new team is coming in. Let me underscore something that Mac just alluded to, which I think the American people may not understand that well, which is that the White House on January 17th, 18th is packed with the incumbents' staff, and on the night of January 19th, everybody's out. And so on the afternoon of January 20th, a totally new team walks in. And as you just alluded to, they're not going to be able to necessarily, everybody's not going to be able to walk into their office. But even if they could be there, everybody could be there in person, pretty much every single person is new to their job, and that's why the transition efforts that the partnership has been promoting are so important at a moment of real national security vulnerability, because what they've tried to do and what we tried to do in a primitive way in 2008, Dennis did extremely well in 2016, is bring in the new folks, pair them up with their counterparts, especially on the national security side, do a couple of exercises so people will know how to react if one of our adversaries seized on this moment of vulnerability and decided to mount some kind of attack on January 20th or 21st.
Dennis, very quickly, didn't the Obama administration do that, and wasn't the exercise pandemic preparedness?
It was, and a great good credit to Lisa Monaco and Susan Rice, the President's Homeland Security and National Security Advisors, respectively. That, in fact, that the exercise that we went through with the incoming team and the outgoing team was precisely that. And look, I learned that, we learned that from Josh.
There is so much that all of you have, just institutional knowledge, that it is just such a great opportunity to get to ask you these questions and for all of you to speak as you did today. I have plenty more questions, but our time is up here, and I want to hand it back to the partnership, and Melody Barnes, I believe, is standing by. Melody?
Thank you so much, Margaret, for that wonderful panel, and hearing that, I'm sure, has led a lot of people to raise additional questions. And we hope on this panel that we can continue that conversation. And for you, Margaret, for those of us in Charlottesville, we hope we can get you back here to your alma mater soon. I am thrilled to be here with you all this morning. We've got a wonderful panel to talk about some really important issues. I want to thank the Center for Presidential Transitions for all the presidential foundations and centers, and the Miller Center for putting this together. You know, it feels for me like January 20th, 2009 was just yesterday. I remember, after taking what was probably one of the worst White House ID photos possible, making my way to my brand new office in the West Wing. The parade was just getting started outside. And when I walked in that office, the phone was ringing. And the person at the other end had a substantive question. And I raise this example because government never sleeps. And in these unprecedented times, in times of economic and political crisis, when the stakes are particularly high, the 75 plus days between an election and an inauguration are extremely important to prepare a new administration to begin its work. In fact, those days, one could say, are barely sufficient. They're absolutely necessary, and they're absolutely critical. So this morning, we've got with us a panel of experts who can help us understand the importance of a transition in highly unprecedented times, and a panel that brings a great deal of expertise to the table because of their previous work. And I want everyone, as we have this conversation, to remember that in the days of a transition, in the early days of a new administration, unexpected things happen that layer on top of the crises that a new administration is already facing. Operation Restore Hope in Somalia, Waco, the Inauguration Day bomb scare, attacks by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. All of these things happened during a transition or during an early days of an administration. And we want this panel to help us to understand how you prepare to deal with those kinds of challenges. So with us this morning, we've got Barbara Perry, who's the Gerald L. Beliles Professor and Director of Presidential Studies at the University of Virginia's Miller Center. We have Stephen Hadley, who was George W. Bush's National Security Advisor. Lisa Monaco, who was President Obama's Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor. And John Podesta, who was Counselor to President Obama and Chief of Staff to President Bill Clinton. I want to thank you all for being with us this morning, and looking forward to diving into the conversation. And with that, Barbara, I'd like to start with you as an historian, as someone who can help us put this in a little bit of context, because
Well, Melody, unfortunately, I've lost sound, but I think I know what the first question was. We had talked about this before, so thank you to everyone for putting together this wonderful panel, to all of our partners. And I want to leave plenty of time for the true experts on this panel, including yourself, Melody, who have participated in transitions and in administrations. But I think my role was to talk a little bit about transitions historically. And one caveat is I've not studied all 44 presidential transitions in depth, but it did occur to me that there may be two ways in which we're using the term transition. And one is the obvious one of the handing over of the reins and the development of a new administration, and particularly in the modern era from FDR onward, where we have a situation that the bureaucracy has proliferated from the Franklin Roosevelt New Deal period onward. So even more important to be populating a vast federal bureaucracy. So in some ways, it's even more important in that modern era from Franklin Roosevelt onward. But it also occurred to me that we think about transitions not only internally about how the reins are being handed over and how the new administration is being populated, or in the case of a second term, the turnover that the first panel talked about that's actually quite necessary to repopulate an administration. But also that I think we think of it in terms of transition, particularly if there is a crisis underway. And so the wonderful essay that Bill Antholis and David Marchik have put together, where they have looked at 5 crises situations, 5 political crises and 5 economic crises in history where transitions have happened, are very helpful. And so I was asked to think about, well, what was the best transition in history and what was the worst? Well, it's usually easy when you're talking about anything related to the presidency and a president coming into office in terms of the worst situation is the Civil War period. And obviously that transition from Buchanan to Lincoln, where the country is literally breaking apart and sliding into civil war, has to be the worst. So we hear about Lincoln setting up his team of rivals, the famous Doris Kearns Goodwin book and the movie made based on that book, that Lincoln was trying as hard as he could to put together a team that even included his rivals or rivals among the various factions in the United States. And we give him credit for that. And yet the country slid into civil war. So the number one challenge that any president has faced coming into office. I suppose I would pick as a good transition and also a historical pattern, if there can be a pattern established, would be the fact that the Reagan to Bush 41, there have not been many sitting vice presidents who've succeeded in being elected president. I think it was Martin Van Buren was the most recent one up until Bush 41. But I think it's helpful, obviously, if there has been a vice president under a president and you go from the same party to the same party and that vice president can carry forward. Obviously, though, there were differences in the party. Bush 41 was viewed as more of a moderate, and there was some skepticism on the part of the Reagan wing of the party about Bush 41. So there was that issue. But Steve Hadley has participated in this wonderful documentary that VPM, Virginia Public Media, and the Miller Center put together called Statecraft, about the Bush 41 foreign policy team. If ever there was an A team that was put together, it was that foreign policy team. So I highly recommend that documentary. But I would also say that a point made by the last panel was that and by the way, Vice President Dick Cheney has said this to us on a number of occasions for our Miller Center oral histories of the 41 administration. He said, we did, if he might say so himself, by terms of the president's golden resume and the foreign policy team was the A+ team, but they hadn't really all worked together as a team. So when the Panama crisis hit over Noriega, he said that they hadn't worked together as a team. By the time, obviously, the first Gulf War came around, they were ready and up and running completely as a well-oiled machine. But it does raise that question of maybe trying to do some tabletop exercises that happened at the end of the Bush 43 era into the Obama era. So with that, I'll lay the groundwork historically and turn it back to you, Melody.
Great. Thank you so much, Barbara. That's great, because you've also moved us forward historically. And John, I want to turn to you next and take us to 2008, 2009. The financial system was collapsing. We were involved in 2 wars. And simultaneously, President-elect Obama knew that he wanted to move several big pieces of legislation, including healthcare. During the transition period and thinking about the policy process, you arranged for General Jones and Larry Summers, who were going to run the National Security Council and the NEC respectively, to operate and to coordinate as though they were in the White House. And I'm curious why you decided that was important, and if in fact it turned out to be an effective strategy.
Thanks, Melody, and thanks to the Miller Center and to the partnership for putting this program on. It's really terrific. And I think this is a good transition from the last panel. But obviously, I had the experience of coming into the Clinton administration in its early days, and then handed off to Andy and Josh at the end as when I was the chief of staff. So I had reflected a lot on that. When I first was asked to co-chair the transition and help run the transition, that was early in the summer. It was before the financial crisis had really developed. I went out, I saw then Senator Obama in his home in Chicago. We talked it through, and I told him that I thought one of the big mistakes that President Clinton had made was that he waited till the very end to pick his White House staff. He concentrated on picking his cabinet. And that I thought was understandable because he had been a governor where his cabinet was his staff. But I suggested that we reverse the process. I noticed that Andy, in talking about the transition to Bush 43, made the same point. And that we picked the White House staff very early so that they could begin in the transition to prepare for the prospect of governing. As it turned out, when Lehman Brothers did collapse, when the financial crisis really hit, I think that was reinforced the need to get people who were being selected, the economic team, the national security team, were selected relatively early post-election to begin to work on what their plans, what their strategies were in both the national security space with respect to Afghanistan and Iraq, and certainly in the economic space. I don't think during that summer, when I first went and saw Josh Bolten in the White House, we were anticipating the kind of economic crisis that unfolded in the fall, but we went to work immediately. And I would say just one last word, and which is, we've talked about the transition as though it's sort of from the beginning to end. There are really two big phases. One's before the election, one's after the election. And before the election, and you know this, Melody, because we worked together on this, there was enough. The first rule of transitions is don't make any trouble for the campaign. So that you have to plan completely in kind of a secure environment, in silence. Don't let anything dribble out that might be a crisis for the campaign or force the campaign off its message. And so we had to develop that economic program almost divorced from the campaign. But once the president was elected, came into office, it was critical that the people who were going to serve him in those key, particularly in those key White House roles and the key cabinet roles, got together, worked together, practiced together, as Barbara said, and in fact, the Recovery Act was developed during the course of that transition.
Yeah. I mean, to your point, people often talk about not looking like you're measuring the draperies in the transition or in a pre-transition process while the campaign is still underway. John, just one more question before I want to turn to Steve. In that moment when we knew about the state of the economy, the dire state of the economy, and had to address, and you talked about the Recovery Act, simultaneously, you've got a candidate who had been campaigning on a number of things that he wanted to accomplish for the country. In that moment and in the transition, how can a transition team think about its long-term priorities as they're also managing an immediate and near-term crisis?
Well, clearly, then President-elect Obama had a lot on his plate. He had made some big promises to the American people. The first thing we ended up doing was trying to make a down payment on those promises through the Recovery Act itself. So there were major investments in education, in clean energy, in putting people obviously back to work, doing the work that needed to get done for the country. And but you also had to simultaneously be thinking about what were the big promises made in the course of the campaign. Number one was the commitment to try to create health care for all. And the beginnings of the Affordable Care Act were really sketched out. The structures of how the White House and HHS would share the responsibility for developing that program began. And that, I think, occupied a tremendous amount of the president's time thinking about how he was going to get that in front of the Congress. And of course, he was successful in passing that. But he also had, because of the economic crisis, he had the challenge of passing Dodd-Frank. And the one that I'm a big climate activist. So the one thing that I felt ended up, because of so much on the table, the climate change got sort of delayed, at least in the Senate, until the second year of the first term, and we were unable to pass the Waxman-Markey bill, which passed in the House. But because of the sequencing, the delay, which you have to make decisions about, and you have to decide what your priorities are, got pushed off a little bit. Obviously, the president came back to it in the second term when I was back in the White House with him, and we got a lot done. But that was one regret that I have from those early days.
And Steve, I want to turn to you now and then also bring Lisa into the conversation, because there you are. You're the National Security Advisor. You know everything that we read in the paper and everything that we're not reading in the paper. And so you have a strong sense, or a very clear sense, of all of the national security challenges facing the nation. And you are also preparing to hand off those issues to a new administration. I'm curious how that affected the way that you made decisions in the final days of the Bush administration.
Well, thanks, and it's a privilege really to be part of this panel and part of this program today. Just a little perspective, I was on a transition from President Ford to President Carter, and to show you how different it was in the day, then all of the NSC staff under President Ford was let go. I was one of 3 or 4 people asked to stay on under the new administration. So when the new team came in, there was basically no staff in the National Security Council. Second thing is, when I came into the office on the 21st of January and turned to the safes in my office in which all the documents are held, the documents were all gone. Their presidential records, they left with the new administration. So when the new team started to fill in, there was no paper record in the White House. That's sort of where we started. I would call it a non-transition in terms of national security. The contrast then was for the Bush team to try to help the Obama team to be able to hit the ground running, and we did that in a variety of ways. And of course, the process was run by the Chief of Staff, Josh Bolten. But on the national security side, since it is a presidential transition, National Security Advisor is a bit kind of coordinator of the team. We encourage the cabinet secretaries to meet with their successors individually, talk about their departments, talk about the issues that were at stake. We also had a series of briefings on substantive issues in which the national security teams of the outgoing Bush administration and the incoming Obama administration met together, and we would talk through where we were on various issues. One of them, interestingly enough, was a Saturday morning session right before inauguration, where we were supposed to talk about Iran, and that weekend we had gotten intelligence that there was a potential threat to the inauguration itself. So that Saturday morning, we had the FBI director come in and brief both the existing and incoming national security teams about that protective threat, what we knew about it, what we were doing about it, and then had kind of a roundtable discussion. And we all thought, you know, we're the veterans, we're helping the new team learn the ropes, so to speak. And Secretary Clinton then asked the most obvious question, which I had not even thought about, which is, well, what do we tell President Obama if he's in the middle of his inauguration speech and he hears a loud bang, a potential bomb attack or something like that? What does he do? Does he hunker down? Do we rush him off the stage? How does he want to handle that moment? Well, that was a very productive discussion, again, brought to the attention of the group by someone with great political experience, Secretary Clinton, and we agreed on what would be briefed to the incoming president, what his options were. But that's the kind of coordination you want to have. There was also a reference to the fact that we thought we would do an exercise with the new team of how to respond to a terrorist incident. And initially we thought we would let them role play the roles, but then we decided they probably wouldn't want to do that, being new to both the positions and new to working with each other. So we kind of stepped through a scenario and tried to explain to them what resources were available, what institutions were available, what kind of processes were in place, so that in the event of a terrorist attack, they would have in some sense had some familiarity. That's the kind of thing you can try to do in a transition, to put the new team in a position to, as soon as they come in the door, handle the responsibilities. As you say, the phone rings as soon as you walk in the office on the 21st of January.
Yeah. And building on that, thank you, Steve. Lisa, building on that, you've got the counterterrorism responsibilities and also the Homeland Security Coordination responsibilities. And in a second, I want to ask you about the tabletop exercise that you ran. It came up in the last panel. It's come up in this panel as well. But I wonder, one, what you might want to add to what Steve was just talking about, and also the question I think a lot of people are curious about, many people ask, what is it that you are saying in a transition period to a campaign? And what is it that you're saying to a president-elect? What kind of national security and homeland security information are you providing? And who makes that decision?
Sure. Well, thanks, Melody. And I'll round out the thank yous of my fellow panelists to the Miller Center and to the partnership for holding this discussion. And it's really nice to be on the screen with some friends and former colleagues. You know, I have been part of 3 different transitions in some way, shape, or form, from President Clinton to President George W. Bush, from President Bush to President Obama, and then, of course, in 2016, the Obama to Trump transition. And it is the importance of this kind of safe, effective, comprehensive handoff that Dennis and others talked about in the prior panel is just so critical from a national security and homeland security perspective, because frankly, and I suspect Steve would agree with me on this, it's a signal to both to our allies about constancy and a signal to our adversaries that this is not a time in which to test us. So that's the first point I would make. You know, in terms of the information flow and who's making those decisions, one thing I think to note is there's a lot that's governed, to the extent it is governed, by norms and convention. So, for instance, in the period, you know, John talked very rightly about the 2 big phases of a transition, before the election and after the election. And that's very, very relevant when we're talking about what information is shared. So before the election, the notion of sharing information, sharing intelligence, it's entirely a product of convention. There's no dictate and kind of requirement to have these types of intelligence briefing and information sharing, or national security information sharing. So the campaign and the candidate gets information and gets a briefing about national security issues, indeed, including threats to the election itself, entirely by dint of the current administration, the sitting administration's willingness to share that information. So that's, I think, it's an incredibly important point for people to be mindful of. And in that case, obviously, it's the president and it's the director of national intelligence setting up a process by which to brief the candidate prior to Election Day. After Election Day, there is a provision in a law that was passed after 9/11, the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, that requires that the president-elect, although I would note, I don't think there's any provision for the vice president-elect to get this information, but there is a requirement that the president-elect get some form of the president's daily brief. And in my experience, that decision is really made by the intelligence professionals. The director of national intelligence will assign a briefer to the president-elect and give the president-elect a kind of a steady set of briefings in the transition period, similar to what the president and his team is getting in that period. And so that's made, and in my view, should be made by the intelligence professionals so there is that steady buildup of understanding what the threats are, what the state of big strategic issues is, so there can be that smooth handoff. The last point I'd make is, I was in one of the transitions from President Bush to President Obama. I was part of one of these briefings. I was then the chief of staff to a formerly little-known Washington lawyer named Bob Mueller when he was chief of staff at the FBI. And I remember quite distinctly going out to Chicago to be with the then FBI director, Bob Mueller, to provide the first briefing that President-elect Obama got on the homeland threats, the state of terrorism threats and other threats to the homeland. And this was days after the election. And it was an incredibly productive session. It was very, very important that we immediately bring the president-elect up to date on those threats. And it is, I think, something that was very clear from then President Bush that needed to happen, and that there needed to be that full information sharing and flow so that there was an understanding of what the threat picture was.
Lisa, I want to stay with you to talk a little bit more about the tabletop exercise. It's, as I said, it came up in the last panel. We heard it. It's come up a little bit here. It's been written about in the press. And as Dennis was saying, the last panel, that you and Susan Rice organized this tabletop exercise on Ebola. And I'm wondering, one, if you can describe in a bit more detail what that tabletop exercise looked like. I mean, Steve was talking about the challenge for people who necessarily in the beginning hadn't worked together to go through a role play type exercise. So what does it look like? And then I also want you to give us a sense of how you think this might work in an environment like the one we're in today, when so much is happening remotely. And this was also a larger question for our panel once you finish, about how we can go through this transition period when many people are not physically in their offices. Well, what are the constraints? What things should flow normally? But Lisa, just start with the tabletop exercise. What does it look like?
Sure. So I think great good credit should go to President George W. Bush and his team, and Steve Hadley and his team, because what we did in 2017, just a few days before the inauguration, was a direct outgrowth and a lesson learned from what the incoming Obama team got from President Bush. It has been talked about already that President Bush laid a clear direction for his team, that there was going to be a professional and comprehensive handoff, and part of that was the tabletop exercise that Steve Hadley referenced. I was at that tabletop exercise again with then FBI Director Bob Mueller, and I remember being in that room as the outgoing national security team from President Bush's administration sat literally side by side and shoulder to shoulder with their incoming counterparts or designees from the incoming Obama administration, and walked through a set of scenarios and talked through the issues that Steve laid out. And to a person, I think people felt like that was an incredibly useful, I know this was the view of the incoming Obama team, it was an incredibly useful, productive, and well-run session. Fast forward 8 years, I'm now the Homeland Security Advisor to President Obama, and we're discussing the transition. And President Obama was very clear in his direction that one of the best things he experienced, and he was very, very thankful to President Bush and his team for having that comprehensive and professional transition. He said that was a really high bar, but let's exceed it. And that was our direction. And my job in that transition was to build out exactly what that tabletop would be. So I knew, even if we hadn't gotten the direction from President Obama, that we were going to apply that same tabletop exercise. And so what we did is we said, all right, what should be the set of issues that we think we really want to relay to the incoming team that they need to be thinking about? So I sat down with my team of mostly career national security and homeland security professionals drawn from across the federal government, said, what are the scenarios that we want to discuss with the incoming team? And we chose a terrorism scenario, a cyber scenario, a hurricane, and we made especially sure to include a pandemic scenario. This is because we knew that the incoming team was going to face some form of emerging infectious disease as a crisis, because we had experienced H1N1, of course, and then Ebola. So it stood to reason that this would happen. And of course, the intelligence community had been saying for several years running that emerging infectious disease and the danger of a potential pandemic is something that was very, very high on the worldwide threat assessment. So we included a pandemic scenario. The scenario was a novel strain of flu. And we put that in the scenario planning, and we had, just like the Bush administration did for the Obama team, we had the incoming designees, national security and homeland security officials, sitting literally next to their counterparts, walking through these sets of scenarios. And I asked my then incoming successor, Tom Bossert, who President Trump had asked to succeed me as Homeland Security Advisor, I asked him to basically co-chair it with me, to walk through these scenarios with the incoming team. And it was something that we knew we were going to do, and we knew we had to do, because it was a virtual certainty that this set of issues would turn up in some form for the new team.
And building on that, and just using that as an example, but there's so many other ways that the incumbent administration and a new incoming administration have to work together. And I'm curious, and this is a question from one of the audience members, about the impact of teleworking, we're taking precautions because of COVID-19. What impact might that have on a transition? And I'll toss that out to the panel for anyone that wants to jump in first. Jump ball.
Well, I mean, I'll start, Melody. Go ahead, Steve.
I was just going to say a couple things. Well, one of the things you need to do, and again, you're going to have to, initially the new team is going to have to rely on the existing staff. So when in the transition to the Obama administration, they made clear that they wanted the senior people on the NSC staff to leave, the senior directors to leave. But we had therefore ensured that there was an existing director who was going to be running each of the respective offices. And that you can do now, and that gives the new team someone to deal with and turn to from the get-go as soon as they come in. I think one of the problems will be access to documents. The other thing we said was, sure, these are presidential records, they'll disappear, but we asked each of these directors who were running these offices in the transition period in the early days of the Obama administration, make copies of the documents you're going to need in order to do your job. That may be a little bit harder to do in terms of a virtual environment. Third thing we did was we in the months running up to the election and after, I was accumulating a list of initiatives that were underway that were decisions that the Bush administration could take, but were also decisions that we could hold over to the Obama administration. And so one of the things I did was I took these stacks of issues and questions and sat down with Tom Donilon and Jim Jones, who was then a national security advisor, and went through one by one and said, look, do you want us to take this action? Is this something that you want us to hold on for the new administration? And then we took the results of that review to our respective presidents and got the sign off. So a lot of that you can do even in a virtual environment. The trick will be access to files and records. That's going to be more difficult in a COVID-19 environment. But the people-to-people part of it, I think, is manageable through the Zoom tools and the other that are available.
Yeah. John, anything you want to?
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, Steve sort of alluded to this, but you're not doing classified briefings on Zoom, so that gives a whole other layer and dimension of difficulty to operate in a classified environment when homes haven't been built for that. The comms are directly related to that. But I think the last panel really hit on the biggest issue, which is building the teamwork that's necessary to be able to create a culture that's going to work together and work together effectively right from the get-go. We've all gotten used to working remotely over the last several months, and I think that there's going to have to be a lot of attention given by the leaders who are either who are there now and are moving forward if President Trump is reelected, and we wish him well. But you also, if there's a new incoming team, creating that culture inside the White House and an administration is just going to be more challenging operating remotely. Eventually, that I think they'll be physically in the office, as we see, most of the people, I guess, in the current administration physically in the office. That has its own challenges. But I think that it's going to be hardest on the national security team, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I am a couple other issues. I'm watching our clock, and there's so much to talk about here. I want to ask a question now about the legislative branch. I mean, obviously, we've been focusing on the executive branch, incoming administration, or fifth year transition for an existing administration. But one of the audience members I know is thinking about this as well. What role for the legislative branch in all this? How can the legislative branch also help facilitate the peaceful transfer of power to ease and improve a transition? So I'm curious about that. And also in doing that, I don't know, Barbara, if there's a historical context for this where the Congress has been better or worse, more helpful than not, that you might also want to add to this. But
well, I'll take I'll take a stab at that. Well, one way I think to look at it is through the lens of 2000. And first of all, I think our nonpartisan conversation today through these panels with people who have participated in these presidencies, as all of my fellow panelists have, from different sides of the aisle. But to show that bipartisanship and interpartisanship can happen and can make our country better. So from Bush 43 to Obama, we've talked about that. And then from Obama to Trump, that the view is the best transitions are best for our country. And so it is best that they are, I guess I should say be best. They are best if they are bipartisan and interpartisan and people are working as teams across party lines. So I wanted to mention something that Melody will know quite a bit about because she came through the the staff process of Edward Kennedy on the Hill, and he was noted for not only having the best staff, but then sending them on into other positions. And so then Melody went on to the White House for President Obama and was involved in the transition. But I bring up Senator Kennedy because it was the case that he reached out to President Bush 43, and Bush 43 reached out to him because President George W. Bush, coming from the governorship of Texas, had worked in a bipartisan way in Texas with members of the legislature there. So he had a pattern and practice of doing that, as did Edward Kennedy. And he's noted, I think, certainly by those who opposed him as having been partisan, but he could be bipartisan and maybe even nonpartisan when it was towards a common legislative goal. And for him and Bush 43, it was No Child Left Behind. It was education reform. And so President Bush 43 invited Senator Kennedy and his family down to the White House within a few days of the inauguration in 2001. And we need to think back at how divided our country was, the vitriol of the Bush v. Gore contest, the uncertainty that went on for so many days that obviously had an impact on the transition. But what does Bush 43 do but reach out to Senator Kennedy, invite him and his family down for a nice supper at the White House, and then to watch at that time the new movie 13 Days about the Cuban Missile Crisis and about Senator Kennedy's brother, President Kennedy. And in turn, if you go to the library at SMU, the George W. Bush Library, you will see a handwritten thank you note for which Senator Kennedy was always very famous. I think he got that from his mother. Always write a thank you note. He wrote a lovely handwritten thank you note to the president, to George W. Bush, thanking him for inviting him and his family to the White House to see that movie. And then he said at the end, I know that we'll have differences, but I hope on education and healthcare we'll find common ground, and I'll be down at the White House for some bill signings. And if that's not a pattern that we need to follow now, I don't know what is.
Melody, I would just add that I think another thing the legislature can do is following the pattern of some of what they've already done, which is memorialize and instantiate in statute best practices. So we have the Transition Act that was passed after 9/11 to instantiate some of the best practices that the Bush administration did do, right? So this requirement for tabletop exercises and the sharing of this type of information is now in that statute. So building on lessons learned and memorializing them and putting them in a statute can, I think, be a very, very helpful role for the legislature for future transitions.
I would also mention something John Podesta mentioned. The most important thing that the Congress, particularly the Senate, can do is speed through the confirmations of the cabinet officials for the new president. That is clearly the most important thing to do. Get the president's team in place so the president can start their administration.
And I would just add one more to the list, which is, of course, the Congress is sworn in on January 3rd. They receive the votes of the Electoral College on January 6th. They begin working before January 20th. And we're talking about transitions in the time of crisis. During that period of time in 2009, there was a good deal of work being done by the transition with the Congress to deal with the simultaneous economic crises that were befalling the country. We worked to save the auto industry, to implement TARP, to build that Recovery Act that got people working again. We were losing 500,000 jobs a month. If Vice President Biden is elected, as I hope he will be, they will have an opportunity to try to do, I think, simultaneously tackle the economic crisis and really work to put in place their strategy for dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. Because the economic crisis, I think, can't really be resolved until we finally resolve the pandemic crisis. So the Congress has a vital role to play And those conversations will start taking place in December, in January. And, as you remember, Melody, the Recovery Act was passed in the first week of February. So and Barbara's calling out Senator Kennedy's work with the president that led to No Child Left Behind and some other legislation that they worked on together is a model for how people can begin right from the get-go to say, can we cooperate on what can we move? Obviously, the constellation of the Congress is also up for grabs in this election. Who's going to control the Senate will be resolved. But once that's known, you have to begin working right off the bat to basically implement a program as you're coming into office.
As we're talking about working across the aisle and bipartisanship, what can get accomplished, I want to ask, and this is probably the final couple of questions, a question about innovation. And from maybe a couple of different perspectives. One, how do we create, or how does a transition team, a new administration, or year 5 administration create a culture of innovation? And when we're thinking about, and it could be an incoming administration, it could be changes in personnel in a year 5. What we've seen read in the paper that Bill Antholis and Dave Marchek wrote, which if people haven't read it, I highly recommend it to them. In terms of personnel, different presidents have approached this in different ways. I mean, there's the team of rivals approach. There's the literal team of rivals approach of bringing in people from an opposing party into your administration, ways to shake up the thinking, ways to broaden the aperture in terms of ideas to create opportunities for innovation. I'm curious, A, what ways do you think we might approach innovation? And B, is it even imaginable at this point, given the polarization and the vitriol that exists, that we might have people from different parties or even different wings of the same party that are coming into an administration or a year 5?
So I'll start, Melody. And I think, you're already seeing, to your last point, a kind of sense of unity amongst the Democratic Party in terms of drawing on the diversity and the expertise and the ideas from the different wings of the Democratic Party. I think that's evident in a lot of what we've seen in the campaign, and certainly in the development of a bunch of Vice President Biden's approaches and positions and platform. On the question of innovation more broadly, I think there needs to be a sense that and a reminder, and people in government should never forget, that they are not the sole source of wisdom on a set of issues. And so having a productive way of collaborating and getting information from the private sector to draw upon innovative ideas outside of government, bring those perspectives to the table, I think is absolutely invaluable. I would point to things that the Obama administration did with the creation of the U.S. Digital Service, and steps like that to try and bring innovative and kind of cutting edge talent into across agencies to deal on the digital side of things. Those types of practices should continue.
I want to throw the ball here on this to John Podesta for just a minute. John, I want to invite you in on this one because I think innovation is great, but there are a lot of ideas out there. I think the trick is figuring out politically what are the ideas whose time has come and are saleable, and then sequencing them. So I will give you a little criticism of the Bush administration on the domestic side, for which I was not responsible, so it's easy for me. We led on Social Security reform with giving people access to the stock market, whereas we probably should have led with solvency. And we probably should have done immigration first before we did Social Security reform, because we did immigration reform too close to an election. So, part of it is new ideas and innovations, but part of it is having a political strategy. What ideas are the ones that our time has come? How do you build the coalition, and what's the priority? And the master at that, in my view, is John Podesta. So, John, tell us how you do it.
Well, I was going to take this conversation a slightly different direction, which is I think presidents usually don't think about performance nearly enough. And the public, quite frankly, is skeptical about whether government can actually deliver. One of the things I think Bill Clinton did at the beginning in putting Al Gore in charge of the Reinventing Government initiative was consciously focused on rebuilding trust in government. And the vice president deserves a lot of credit for being able to do that and have the American people have the sense that government was delivering. And I think that you saw that in public attitude about their faith in the ability for government to deliver. So I would advise the administration, whoever's leading it, to pay more attention to that. And again, I think that one of the things that, because I'm paying attention to this campaign, that the vice president has done is woven a story together about the need to simultaneously attack the pandemic crisis, the economic crisis, the racial justice crisis, and the climate crisis. That takes huge amount of coordination at the White House level, a top of mind strategy. But in the end of the day, it really means implementation. That's got to be number one.
Well, with our last 1 minute and 45 seconds, I'm just curious what.
Give it to Barbara.
Right.
Barbara, give us some history. But just no matter who wins the election, what you think the biggest challenge is for a transition. And, Barbara, you can obviously put that in historical context or what you've heard through oral history.
Right. Well, if you are turning to me, may I offer this? And it is a bit of bipartisanship as well, because it is an interview that we did, Russell Riley and I, for the Bush 43 project, but it was with Dick Gephardt, who was the House Minority Leader during Bush 43. And this is after 9/11, and he's speaking to the Pentagon is still smoking, and he's speaking to the president. And he says, I said, Mr. President, the most important thing now is that we all trust one another. This is about life and death. Our first responsibility is to keep the people safe. We failed. We all failed, and we have to do better. The only way, I know politics intrudes in everything that happens here as it should, but this we have to keep politics out. We cannot play politics with this. We have to do whatever we can to do the right things to keep the country safe and to avoid anything like this happening again. It obviously was related to terrorism, but I certainly think now in this matter of life and death with COVID, that's what we have to keep our eye on that.
Well said. Thank you for doing that. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed being in conversation with you all. Could do it for another hour. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. And now I want to turn this over to Amy Walter.
Hey, Melody. Thank you so much. And again, I'm Amy Walter. I'm the senior editor at the Cook Political Report. Going, like many of you, on little sleep, so trying to wrap my head around getting this transition correctly. But I'm really excited for this next panel that I get to moderate. Just to paraphrase the late Governor Mario Cuomo, candidates are able to campaign in poetry, but they have to govern in prose. And I think no one understands that reality better than the four women who I'm going to talk to in the next moment about making that transition from being a candidate, even if that candidate happens to be the sitting president of the United States, to then coming in post-November and transitioning in that time to taking office in January and putting forward an agenda that you talked about nonstop on the campaign trail. All of the folks I'm speaking with have also had experience coming in at times of crises, political or economic. So I think they're going to have great insights into what the 2021 process may look like. So I'm going to introduce them right now. I'm going to start here with Alexis Herman, who served as Secretary of Labor under President Clinton. She was also chair, CEO of the 92 DNC and deputy director of then President-elect Clinton's transition team. Karen Hughes, counselor to President George W. Bush. She also served as his director of communications as Texas governor and on his 2000 campaign. Valerie Jarrett, senior advisor to President Obama, the director of White House Office of Public Engagement and Intergovernmental Affairs, and Margaret Spellings, who was the Secretary of Education under George W. Bush, and she also worked for the Texas governor in his administration as a senior advisor. Thank you all for being here. And Valerie, I'm going to start with you because not only do you share with your panelists this unique experience of going from campaign to governing, but you have done it for a candidate going into a first term, and then a president who served, obviously, who won and then went on to serve a second term. So can you help folks understand what that looks like, being the candidate and then being the incumbent, and how you approach both of those?
Sure, thank you. And hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. So I think it's absolutely right to say you campaign in poetry. It's aspirational, particularly when you were going in for your first term. You set forth a robust agenda of all of the things that you want to do for the country. You contrast yourself with your predecessor. And then suddenly, you're the dog that catches the bus, and you have to move swiftly to more concrete strategic plans for how you want to get done everything you said you wanted to get done and deal with all of the incoming. I think that I was one of the co-chairs of President Obama's transition in the first term, together with John Podesta and Pete Rouse, and we started about in July. President Obama did his due diligence by speaking to former Democratic chiefs of staff to get a sense of how they organized going in. And then we really began our work in earnest, working with the policy folks from the campaign and starting to line up who we thought would be most effective to do the policy work once he was in office. And so it's a combination of thinking through how you're going to implement the strategies that you articulated during the campaign, the priorities that you've articulated, finding the right people. And we spent a lot of time interviewing candidates, vetting candidates. President Obama made it very clear that we were only going to be as good as our weakest link, and so he wanted to make sure we assembled a team that not only shared his values and his integrity, but also his priorities, and then kind of hit the ground running. One point I will make that doesn't get as much attention as I think it deserves is how incredibly helpful President Bush and his entire team were to us during the transition. He made it very clear he wanted a smooth transition of power, even though we had disagreed on just about every possible policy you could think of. They were a treasure trove of information that proved invaluable, and they couldn't have been more open and candid and forthcoming with us to make sure that we were equipped with the benefit of their experience so that we could hit the ground running as soon as and as easily as possible. Going into a second term is different. You now do not have the initial challenge of a team that may have worked together in the campaign, new people coming in. President Obama said often in the beginning he had the best players on the field. By the end of the second term, he felt he had the best team, and that's very different. Many members of our cabinet stayed for the second term, but President Obama did go through this disciplined process, going actually every 2 years of saying, okay, here's where we are, here are our priorities, what's must do, what would be great to do, what is nice to do, so that it would help frame our energies and time management as we went into each successive 2-year period. I think the final thing I would say about the first transition is, of course, there are those unexpected. Nobody was expecting for us to go through what happened in September of 2008 when Lehman Brothers went into bankruptcy and the ensuing crash of the banks teetering on collapse, the automobile industry going into bankruptcy, millions of people losing their jobs and their homes, and that's where the challenge comes. How do you push forward your affirmative agenda while you're dealing with the cards that you inherit? But I will say that the continuity of going from a Republican administration to a Democratic one was made much easier by having a very helpful and supportive predecessor. And then going to the second term, once you win, that's in a sense an affirmation of what you did in your first term, which makes you realize two things. You must be on the right track in terms of how the country views your accomplishments. But secondly, how quickly 4 years goes, and then it's a finite period of time, and it's kind of a rush to the finish beginning on day one of that second term.
Right. Really good points. And in fact, I'm going to go to one of your predecessor, somebody worked for your predecessor, Karen Hughes, and you also have the rare experience of a very compressed transition time. Bush v. Gore happened December, I think it was December 12th of 2000. Now you have to go from December, you now have a month before you're inaugurated. And I want you to talk a little bit about how you balanced, you personally, and then folks who were working with the Texas Governor Bush in that period in between when you were still doing the legal work on the legal case, you were essentially still a candidate, you were not yet president-elect, and then how you made that transition work.
Well, it was, Amy, as you can imagine, it was just an excruciating time. I mean, the only thing that gets you through something as intense as a presidential campaign, in the last couple of months, every day you tell yourself, well, in 2 months it's over. And then when you come to election day, you stumble across, and of course it wasn't over. And so I felt like I'd run a marathon, and somebody told me, keep running and we'll let you know when you can stop. And so it was personally a very chaotic time. For example, if we were going to move to Washington, I needed to sell my house. I wasn't wealthy. I couldn't afford to have 2 houses. And so I, things like that I couldn't put my house on the market because I was afraid the reporters would take that as being, presumptuous that we had won. And so it was a very difficult time. We had several things, though, that really benefited us. One is that President Bush, when he first set out to campaign for president, actually tasks the chief of staff in the governor's office at the time, Clay Johnson. He said, I want you to come up with a plan for what I do when I win. And that was in June of 1999, 16 months before the election. So Clay Johnson had been quietly working on transition planning all that time. And at some point in the fall, had given me a very comprehensive set of information about the communications functions of the White House and how they're set up and how they're organized. President Bush had actually talked to me the day of the third debate. I would have thought there would have been other things on his mind, but the day of the third debate, we were on a long walk around the lake at the home where we were staying in Missouri, and he started talking to me out loud about how he was thinking about structuring the White House staff. And so we had some preparation. The Florida, however, during the recount, it was so intense, as you said, with we were on phones with the lawyers. I was on the phone with James Baker and Margaret Tutwiler in Florida every day. I was in Austin with the president. And so there really wasn't much time during Florida itself to be thinking about the transition to the White House. And so that happened all very quickly when the election was decided on December 12th. We immediately made plans to go to Washington. We did go to Washington, met with President Clinton and with President Bush, met with President Clinton and Vice President Gore. We tried to meet with some of our counterparts. The transition team had the goal of having the senior staff appointed by December 15th, and so we already had a pretty good idea of who the senior staff was going to be. And by the way, one of the things that President Bush did, I think, very effectively was blended a team of people from Texas who knew him well with a team of experienced people who knew Washington well. And so Andy Card was our chief of staff, Nick Callio, our legislative director, Vice President Cheney obviously had served as chief of staff and Secretary of Defense and knew Washington well. And so he really blended those experiences. And so those of us who I remember President Bush, when he gave me my job description, I said, what do you mean by this counselor to the president? And he said, I want you to go to every meeting where a major decision is being made. I want you to tell the people in the room how I will approach that decision, and then I want you to tell me what you really think. And so I was going to a dizzying blur of meetings about things about which I often knew very little. But we had people around the table with our senior staff who also knew a great deal about Washington and about the policy issues.
Right. Alexis, Herman, I want to come to you. You obviously involved in the 92 campaign on the political side. You move over to do the transition. And you're one of the people here on this panel who is working for a candidate who defeated a sitting incumbent. So this was going and sitting down with the folks who you beat their guy, right? So how was that? What is that experience like, sitting down with the people? This may happen this year, where you come into an office where the sitting staff they're not leaving because their guy's been termed out. They're leaving because, well, you beat him.
Well, it's interesting you pose the question that way, Amy, and thank you, and hello to my fellow panelists, all of whom I've had the good fortune to work with in some capacity over the years. I'll tell you what it's like. For me personally, I will never forget the day, and Karen used the term transition planning, which is something you don't really talk much about. That's that secret moment when you're engaged with the transition process and you can't talk about it, and no one knows that you're in this tiny office preparing for that eventuality if the president wins, and then you talk formally about transition. So for me, I was a part of that small office with transition planning that eventually led to the transition process. And I did accompany that day to the White House, Warren Christopher, who was the head of transition, and Vernon Jordan, and the meeting with Andy Card. You never know how that's going to feel, right? But I have to give Andy a lot of credit, and I remember that day very well. He was very professional. He was very welcoming. We were sitting there in the Roosevelt room, and you have your list of the critical issues that you want to make sure you understand what the handoff process is going to be about. So for us, in our transition process, we were very clear about the critical issues in the key agencies that we wanted to engage the White House on, and not just the larger, quote, White House agenda. So for us, it turned, quite frankly, into a real business meeting. It was a real, quote, business session that was very respectful. But honestly, I had a lot of trepidation going into it because we just really weren't sure about the receptivity and the degree of cooperation that we would receive. I had a little insight because I was, of course, in the Carter administration as counsel to the Secretary of Labor and Director of the Women's Bureau. So I had experienced that transition on the other end, but really from an agency perspective in a very limited role. But my Republican counterpart, and I'll never forget, it was Connie Newman at the time, who was President Bush's leader of the OPM. And she was the liaison at the Labor Department during the Carter years. And so Connie, who is a dear friend to this day, was my contact. So I expected, quite frankly, that transition to mirror what I had experienced many years before as a part of the Ford-Carter transition. And I was not disappointed. And I know that with other administrations, there have been challenges. But I have to say that handoff that day in the Roosevelt room for us was respectful, disciplined. We did not go into the agencies not knowing who each of our contacts would be. And that's very important. And there was a White House team that made it very clear to us that they would be available to us for whatever we needed. And we had to take advantage of that offer. So for me, respect and cooperation and clear lines of communication are what you really need as you engage in that process, and get rid of all of the preconceived notions and ideas and the partisan moments that often can come into play when you've just come off of a very political environment to win an election.
Yeah. Boy, I hope there are certain people listening very closely. That's wonderful. Thank you. Margaret Spellings, I want to talk to you about sort of the process of this. And, again, you've been on a campaign. You and Karen Hughes, you both worked for the governor, so you know him personally a little bit better than, sort of a traditional campaign staffer who maybe never met this candidate before, it never worked for them. But how do you ensure that, and Valerie touched on this, how do you ensure that all these promises that you make on the campaign trail, all these commitments you make on the campaign trail are able to translate into policy, especially in those first chaotic 100 days as you're still trying to figure out, where the bathrooms are, to know that you're staying sort of focused on keeping what you talked about on the campaign moving forward into governing?
Thank you, Amy. It's terrific to be with everybody, these fantastic women leaders. I think it's a testament to both of our bosses that we were all involved with them. As we all know, things go better when you have women involved. So anyway, it's great to be here. Yes, I think you have to know what you're about, and you have to have a game plan and focus and priorities. And in President Bush's case, we knew in that secret moment that Alexis talked about, that education was something that obviously had great comfort for him. I mean, he didn't need a lot of tutoring or talking points, had a great record in Texas, real nexus between what one does at state policy and the understanding there and what we were trying to achieve in Washington, something that in the aftermath of a contentious election really is something that Americans can gather around. There's great consensus around education. That certainly was true in the 8 years of the Bush administration, working with people like Senator Ted Kennedy and Congressman George Miller, and continued into the Obama administration. I was, in fact, on a panel yesterday with Arnie Duncan, my good friend. And so we had, we leaned into those issues that I think all Americans, nod their heads about. Now, in terms of just managing that, I really want to emphasize Karen's point about having people around you as president who know you well, who know what you're about, as well as people who know Washington well. And I remember, having that feeling of, gosh, I don't know a heck of a lot about what they're talking about, but I do know a heck of a lot about George W. Bush. And I know how he thinks about things. I know how he thinks about priorities and the like. And so I think being, to Alexis's point, humble in the opportunity, understanding the gravitas of a situation, the soberness of being at the White House, and the awesomeness of your charge. And really, there's plenty of work for everybody figuring out how to create a symphony of players with the expertise that can get something done. In our case, the first priority, as was said by Barbara Perry, was No Child Left Behind, and all of the things that President Bush did on week one in office to build those bridges, build those relationships, and get things done. I do have one quick story about that. When he first met with Senator Kennedy in the Oval Office, literally the second day of the administration probably, and I remember him saying, Karen, you were probably in the room at the time, so the press is going to come in here and they're going to ask us about school choice and vouchers. And here's what I, President Bush, am going to say about that. I'm going to say we had a great conversation, that we're off to a great start, and not take the bait, essentially. And of course, Senator Kennedy returned the favor, and I think it was the first of many goodwill gestures that they both showed to each other along the way, and netted out in a really important piece of landmark legislation and ultimately mental health parity, and on and on.
Well, Margaret, that's interesting. My question about that too is, obviously this was a key issue on the campaign trail, but did the fact that the election was so contentious and that it ended the way it ended push the idea of having a bipartisan deal with Senator Kennedy to the very top? And it might have been in there at some point, but it might have been number 3 or 4.
Absolutely. And you'll recall during the transition when then President-elect Bush invited Washington leaders to the governor's mansion in Texas, including Congressman George Miller, who had watched and admired the work that we were doing in Texas to close the achievement gap, to measure and disaggregate data and invest resources and whatnot. And so absolutely, timing is everything in life and certainly in politics and policy, that we had this need for something that could be common cause across the aisle and a cast of characters and some players. And frankly, we were taking Republicans where they had never gone before, and maybe some were uncomfortable about going, the Judd Greggs of the world, the people who were, heretofore abolish the Department of Education type Republicans, but they were following their leader in important ways, and I think that is how we started the conversation.
Alexis, I want to go back to something you said about, being in this tiny little office and you can't talk to anybody and you're sort of holed up there for a while. Can you sort of demystify this process for the rest of us about like what this actually looks like? And everybody here on this panel has made clear that this kind of planning starts over the summer of an election year. So
Yes.
You're in a windowless office for 6 months? Is that what it looks like?
Well, I ran, as you indicated, the 92 convention. I was CEO of that. And I went immediately, that was July of 1992. I went immediately from the convention operation, shutting it down, to being a part of this small office called transition planning. And I think every president is different in terms of how they approach it. But the first rule for us, and there were 5 of us in this office, was that we could have no conversations with anyone, especially Bill and Hillary Clinton, because they just didn't want to, quote, jinx the process. I mean, that was like drilled into our heads. You can't talk about it. You can't talk about it. And so I was like, well, how do you do the work if you can't get, they said, don't worry, you'll get the input, but you can't talk about it. So the first thing you do is you get this small team and you get the ground rules straight. And that was ours. You couldn't talk to anyone. And I'm in Little Rock along with this huge campaign operation with Carvel and all the boys, right? And it's like, well, why do I say I'm here? And they gave me some script about labor. I can't even remember what it was now. And I did a little of that in terms of labor unions. And I'd been at the Labor Department before, but I could never talk about transition planning. And so what happens, to be very specific, you have sort of 3 lanes in transition planning. There's the White House lane, where you're looking at the White House operation, that first 100 days of how you launch the presidency, and the cabinet. The second lane is that national security lane. And you have to have someone in transition planning that already has a national security clearance so that they can really be doing the very quiet and delicate work of all of the national security issues with a national security clearance that you actually can get ahead of time from the agency, from the State Department, because you do have to reveal, who's working on what. And then the third lane, and this is how we were charged, was then, quote, everything else. It was called the agency liaison. That was my portfolio. I was responsible for organizing all of the issues, the critical issues in all of the agencies that you would, quote, inherit as the incoming administration, but also you had to take into account the plan that was going on in what I call Lane 1, the president's agenda, the White House agenda, those first 100 days, and you had to know what agencies would impact the execution of the president's agenda. So in my case, of course, Bill Clinton's economic plan was going to be the first thing, on the table. Which was a heavy lift for Treasury, a heavy lift for the Economic Council. So getting very clear about the Treasury operations, the Department of Commerce operation, all of those agencies that especially impacted that first 100 days would be at the top of my list. So in that transition planning process, you are laying out the priorities, you get these lanes straight, and then you tentatively select a key leadership team that will go into each of these areas should the president win. Now that's very painful. The other hat I wore, I was co-chair for Senator Kerry's transition operation. I have to say it was one of the most effective operations that I'd ever been a part of, but of course he didn't get elected. And so, but you have all of these people that you're quietly reaching out to. Some of them you can't tell them what their role is going to be. You simply have to say to them, I need you to be on standby should the president win. So you have a team in waiting, if you will, that you have to be ready to deploy the very next day should the president win the election. Actually, at midnight that night, that's how we were set up. So it's a quiet operation, but it's strategic. It's a lot of planning. It's aligning that first 100 days of the president's agenda, and it's making sure you have a handle on the very critical issues that the previous administration may have been dealing with, that you know you're going to inherit on day one, and there can't be time to think about what are you going to do. You have to have made some preliminary decisions about how we operate. I was focused on this entire program, but I was particularly interested when the earlier panel, they said Hillary Clinton actually raised in the briefing with the Obama administration what happens, because they were inheriting obviously an environment that was very different from ours, if there's a bombing at the inauguration. So you have to really be thoughtful about what you're inheriting. And it's not all about you and what you want to execute, but also what's on the current administration's plate. So I could go on, but that's a little bit in terms of the secretness that goes on in transition planning.
Thank you for drawing the curtain back for us. I'm going to start by asking this to Valerie Jarrett, but anybody else can feel free to jump in as well. These are some questions that we had gotten from registrants to this conference, and a number of them reference career government staff. Like, how do you work with them? One question was about the most useful types of information that were shared with you by career staff, and another one was about the recommendations you can give to career staff about how to prepare for a transition, especially if what we're doing is transitioning from one party in power to the next.
Well, again, I think that depends on the cooperation you get from your predecessor. As I mentioned, President Bush made it clear to everyone government-wide that he expected full cooperation. And so that made our job a lot easier. We did have, I think as Karen mentioned earlier, we had both people who knew Washington, had been in the government before. Having John Podesta as one of the co-chairs of the transition was enormously helpful. Pete Rouse was really helpful as well. I was the newcomer to Washington, but I knew the Obamas. And so I think it was really important that we signaled to the career teams all over, the professionals, that we valued their input, that we weren't just going to come in with this top-down set of priorities without listening to their wise counsel, and to try to get the ball running by showing them the respect that they deserve. Many of them, particularly in agencies like the national security agencies, intelligence agencies, Justice Department, been around for a long time, and we deferred a lot to their professional judgment, not just during the transition, but throughout our time in office. And so it was important to hit the ground running well with them. Again, made much easier by cooperation from President Bush. The final point I would make is that as we populated the agencies, many of us who were political appointees, myself included, spent a lot of time, and this is post-inauguration, going to the agencies and meeting with the career team to try to demystify who we were. There's always this sense of like, oh, here they come, and they think they know everything, and we wanted to really lift them up by having senior people from the White House get outside of the White House and travel around to the agencies. And that was a priority in all 8 years. And I enjoyed it. I learned a lot from those career folks.
I'll jump in there. I think, our career public servants are a treasure. And, our culture carriers within agencies and departments, incredibly knowledgeable and just a tremendous asset to a president and to our citizens. You need to develop those relationships on day one, especially in places like the OMB, where they're going to help you develop the president's budget and detail around things like the State of the Union that are quickly going to be developed and delivered. And so my own experience was they were valuable. We listened to them, and I think to overlook or to suggest that they're part of a deep state or some such is really disrespectful and tragic, because they really are such a treasure to our citizens and to any administration.
Margaret, a couple of things. One is at the White House. When we first went to the White House, I realized that there's such a source of institutional knowledge. And so I remember one of the things the first couple of weeks, I was planning some event and I was going to do it in the Rose Garden. And somebody said to me, "Oh, you can't do that. We only use the Rose Garden for good news." And so just the little things like that about what the different rooms are used for and what is the tradition and what is not. Where I found that the career, because our transition was so truncated, we did not really have much interaction with our predecessors at the White House the first time when we came in. Where I really found the career staff to be absolutely invaluable to me was when I went to the State Department in the second term, when I became Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. And public diplomacy was sort of at the time a stepchild at the State Department. You may remember that the former U.S. Information Agency had been merged into the State Department, and there were still a lot of hard feelings when I got there. They were still calling the merger the murder of USIA, and so I wanted to send a signal that the public diplomacy was important and was valued. And so one of the first things I did was have my deputy, Dina Powell, who'd come from the White House Personnel Office. I said, "I want you to recruit some of the best Foreign Service officers at the State Department, because I want other people at the State Department to look and say, Dan Smith is going to public diplomacy," because I wanted to send a signal that this was important and that we were going to have the very best people. And Dan Smith became my chief of staff, and Gretchen Welch and others who were fabulous career public servants and who taught me so much every day that I was at the State Department. And I agree wholeheartedly with Margaret. They are absolutely a treasure and were completely invaluable to my ability to do a job on behalf of the country.
I'm going to throw out the sort of elephant in the room, so to speak, about thinking about the potential transition in 2021 from if former Vice President Joe Biden were to win. We know that this president has had a lot of rhetoric around accusations that the election will be rigged, that he would leave as long as the election is fair. I'd just like for all of you to sort of weigh in on a couple of questions. One, your assumption that after 200 plus years of peaceful transitions, if you still believe that that is going to be the case this time around. And the second is, even if we assume that this is going to go smoothly, if Biden were to win and we have inauguration day and a new president is sworn into office, that the transition, as you are talking about, which just all sounds lovely and people are helpful and work together and use the time in between election day and the inaugural to learn stuff from each other, whether you think that's going to be the case this time around. Who wants to start with that one?
Well, I'll just say I hope so. And I think we have to remember that we've had difficult elections before in our history. I went back in preparation for this and reread President Bush's speech the night that he became president on the night that it became clear that he had won the election on December 12th when the Supreme Court stopped the recount in Florida. And I read that speech, and I think that's exactly the speech that we need to hear. And one of the things that he talked about were the lessons of history. He talked about another difficult election in 1800 when there was a tie in the Electoral College, and it went to the House. And I think it took 6 days and 36 votes or something to be resolved. And Thomas Jefferson became the president. And that was the first transfer of the presidency in our young democracy's history from one party to another. And President Jefferson wrote shortly thereafter, he talked about the steady character of our countrymen is a rock to which we can safely moor. And President Bush, the night that he was determined to have won the election, referred to that and talked about the steady character of the American people and urged respect for each other and urged a generosity of spirit and respect for our differences. And he went out of his way to say, I'm not the president of one party, I'm the president of one country. And whether you voted for me or not, I will seek to earn your support and to serve your best interests. He was very gracious to Vice President Gore and said he knew they'd both gone through the same thing and that he couldn't imagine how difficult the moment must be for him. And he thanked his supporters, both his own supporters and Vice President Gore's supporters. And so I think that's what we need to hear. I certainly hope that we will hear it this time. And I think there have been difficult and divisive elections before in our history. And I hope that gives us some comfort as we look back and realize that our country has done this before many times.
I would add to what Karen has just said. You know, I guess in the words of the great prophet, I remain a prisoner of hope, the way Karen has just said this. And, you know, she made me remember how I felt listening to President Bush that day. I was literally still in my office trying to quickly pack up my books and my desk and to get out of that moment on Capitol Hill. And I don't remember who, quite frankly, that agency liaison was from the Bush transition who was there. But I was there with tears in my eyes. And I remember this person looked at me and said, I know this is a painful moment for you personally. And I said, yeah, it is. But, you know, we have a new president. And that spirit which we must all move forward. I don't know what this new moment is going to be like. I honestly don't. We talked about those terrific career civil servants. I think if this election is elongated, that we're going to be very dependent on their steadiness and the continuity of their leadership. Because Social Security checks still have to go out and unemployment benefits have to still be taken care of. I mean, the business of government is about the lives of everyday people. So I hope that we will show respect if we are in a moment of crises, and I hope not bitterness. But I hope we will remember these career servants that we've just talked about, because much will be on their shoulders during that time.
Valerie,
Amy, I think what I would add is this. Well, first of all, to state the obvious, President Trump is no President Bush. And yes, it's a contentious campaign, but it's been a contentious 4 years. I do take hope from Vice President Biden's comments a couple of weeks ago where he said, I'm running as a Democrat, but if I win, I'll govern as the American president and represent the whole country. I don't feel that President Trump has done that in this last 4 years, which is deeply troubling. And I am hopeful by nature. I still believe in hope and change, but I also recognize how hard it is to be hopeful. And my counsel to Johannes Abrahams, who was my former chief of staff the last term in the White House, and I met him when he was a field organizer, having just graduated from Yale. back in 2007, field organizer in Iowa. So I've known him a long time, and I'm so proud that Vice President Biden has given him this responsibility of managing his transition. But what I said to him is, look, hope for the best, but you better plan for the worst. And I think there's going to be a lot more responsibility on Vice President Biden's transition team to reach out to those career folks, because I honestly don't think that they're going to get a lot of cooperation from the most senior people, and certainly not from the president. I'd like to hope that there are other folks who work in the White House or who are political appointees who we could appeal to their better angels going into this transition. I was heartened by the comments that we saw from many of the Republicans on the Hill who doubled down to reinforce there will be a smooth transition of power. But I am actually not confident, and I'm worried, deeply and profoundly worried, that if the election goes much beyond November 3rd, which I think we should realistically expect it might, with so many people voting absentee for their own safety, that this notion that that somehow is an illegitimate way when we've been doing it in the military since the Civil War and many of our other states for a very long time, and that it isn't until now that it's really been questioned in terms of its legitimacy. I worry that that is ginning up a lot of anger among the American people. And so I think the challenge for whoever is elected is not just to ensure that government itself is functioning well going into the next term, but that the polarization of our country begins to heal. And I think that is going to be a real challenge no matter who is elected.
Just quickly to add kind of a practical point is, the beat goes on. I mean, January 20th is going to come, and as Alexis says, the business of government must go on. If there's a transition, executive orders that had been issued fairly recently can be revoked. If President Trump is reelected, there will be a changing of the guard. There will be personnel changes. And so just the practical reality of making the thing go, I hope, will cause people to rise to the occasion and get over the politics and get on with it one way or the other. And, we've all been privileged to serve in ways that for two people who are respectful of the role they played and certainly signaled that to the people around them. And I hope and pray that will be the case this go around.
Well, that leads, we have just a couple minutes left, and it leads to this question that we had from one of the audience about the recommendation that you could give to career leadership to prepare for whatever moment may be coming for them. I mean, you all have talked about how you leaned on them during a transition, but what should they be prepared for? Alexis, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I certainly do. I think it is so important, and I loved it when Valerie talked about the outreach that they did in the very beginning. It's important to remind them that they are public servants of the American people, that at the end of the day, that is who they serve, and that they have to reach deep into themselves to take pride in the work that they are doing, and to know that even if they aren't applauded or thanked, that they are making a difference. And you have to, put on that armor and be prepared to just continue to do your work. Continue to bloom where you are planted in whatever agency it is, and remind yourselves and your colleagues that you are making a difference on behalf of the American people.
I think that is very
and I
well
would
said.
say to understand what the principal, what the president wants to accomplish, and get smart and get strategic and get creative about how you help him achieve those objectives.
Just add a priorities, because that's one of the hard things when you're first there is what's the priority? What do I need to do right now? And so sort of a clear sense of what needs to be done and when and what's most important, because there's so much coming at you. It's very hard to have that clarity.
And Karen, I agree with that, but I think what I was responding to if we don't have a clear outcome, it's going to be up to them to keep that focus. And if you're not getting that direction, that's very, very hard. And so I say they may have to go internally.
And I think they have been, frankly, beaten down a lot over the last nearly 4 years. And so I think that if Vice President Biden wins, it's going to be incumbent upon him to lift them back up, validate the important role that he believes that they play, make it clear, where there have been changes in the norms, let's say, like an independent Justice Department, or relying on your scientists, or believing your intelligence communities, to just name three, that I think you have to be very intentional if you're Vice President Biden, and how you go in and rehabilitate the important role that you believe they play. Because I can assure you that there are many who are feeling really pretty wounded over this last 4-year period.
Well, we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank everybody on this panel for some incredible insights and advice. Alexis Herman, Valerie Jarrett, Karen Hughes, Margaret Spellings, and I'm going to hand it back to Bill and Tolis, who's going to close it up for us.
Well, thank you, Amy. What a terrific panel that was. I think we've really, in just about 3 hours, have covered an enormous waterfront. And huge thanks to all of our panelists, who I will come back to. Let me go to some key takeaways, or at least what my notes are from the last great 3 hours. First, the hallmark of our system is the peaceful transfer of power. You don't want to play politics with that. We have one sitting president, and that president needs to sprint through the tape. The Constitution allows that, but also needs to show deference to the people's will. And that means helping the incoming president prepare if the sitting president is defeated. Even in the worst transition, Abraham Lincoln's, that's happened when 7 states seceded between Election Day and Inauguration Day. But there are also great examples of great handovers within a party, from Reagan to Bush 41, but really between parties. In that contested 2000 election, both then Vice President Gore's gracious consolation speech, but then also President Bush preparing well behind the scenes, and President-elect Bush being ready to take office. Also, we saw a terrific transfer in Bush 43 to Obama. President Bush knew, particularly from the searing experience of 9/11, how important it was to have a peaceful transfer in case there was an emergency. And there was an emergency at that moment, the 2008 financial crisis. My second takeaway is that there are 2 phases to a transition. There's the pre-election phase, when the incoming team is preparing itself. And that's while the election is going on. They need to work silently on personnel and policy planning, and they should stay away from the campaign. That makes it easier for both parts of the same team to do their job. But then after the election, the transition team needs to trust the planning and start to build real teams. That's going to be a big challenge this year. We heard that. COVID is not just a crisis, which will need to be addressed along with an economic crisis, hopefully not a political crisis. But then we also have the racial justice reckoning. But then COVID also presents real challenges, building a culture, as we all feel every day in our own workplace, how hard it is to work with one another. Here, you're building a brand new team, and doing that in a state of crisis is particularly going to be hard. And then there are additional challenges on that. Access to documents, access to not just having security clearances, but to secure operating facilities. We're not prepared for secure communications, and we will need to work that out in the transition period. Point 3 goes to building the team. Margaret Spellings referred to it as a symphony of players. Dennis McDonough talked about the importance of diversity in a team that looks like America, and both of those things are really important. The White House team is particularly critical. Getting that done first can be super helpful But then it's also important to focus on the cabinet. And as we heard Mac McClarty say, having the cabinet done by Inauguration Day is a good benchmark, at least having selected those people, because they're going to have to go through confirmation hearings. The confirmations pose an increasing challenge because of politics with the confirmations. And perhaps that's something that the whole country in this moment of crisis can focus on doing well, to not deepen the discord, but to try to get beyond it. But then finally, also trusting the civil service in the cabinet agencies and even in the White House. The National Security Council staff are often civil servants or foreign service officers or military personnel. But there are a host of civil servants across the federal government who are prepared to help and who really pride themselves in preparing a president and the new cabinet to hit the ground running when they arrive. Takeaway 4 is prepare for the worst. And that really requires coordination between the incoming team and the outgoing team. We heard about national security challenges, including with the current and sitting administration thinking through what decisions they have to make and what ones can be deferred to the incoming president, and then coordinating with that president. That's challenging because of security clearances and other things, but it is something that previous transitions have done well, and something that should be able to happen even in the current pandemic. And the current pandemic proves the importance of this. Planning for pandemics. The next pandemic could be a very different one. We could have different transmission rates, infection rates, and also mortality rates. So how would, if there was a different pandemic kicking off, how would the government respond differently if the circumstances were different? Some emergency efforts can be done with Congress as well during a transition period. That is, congressional response to emergencies, funding new activities, either in an economic crisis or the one that we're doing now. You may need to be negotiating those arrangements during the transition period, as is what happened in 2008 to 2009. And then finally, the fifth and most important one is look for opportunities to bring the country together. Going from campaigning to governing is a really difficult challenge. In Bush 43, particularly coming out of the contentious election, President-elect Bush immediately started reaching out to Senator Ted Kennedy. And that really set the mood and tone for a year of hard work that led to No Child Left Behind. President Clinton similarly started focusing with the outgoing administration and in the early months of his administration on passing what became NAFTA, which happened in President Clinton's first year. And after a rocky first 6 months of that administration, when a budget was finally approved, he turned to a bipartisan piece of legislation that helped bring the country back together. So I think that was my 5 takeaways. We look forward to hearing yours. Please be in touch with both us and our friends at the Partnership for Public Service. And now is my time to start thanking people. First, big thanks to all of our panelists. What a pleasure and a joy to have 5 former chiefs of staff, a former national security advisor, 3 former cabinet secretaries, 2 counselors to the president, 2 of the finest journalists in the country, Margaret Brennan and Amy Walter, heroes to not just me, but my 2 daughters, and my superstar colleagues, Melody Barnes and Barbara Perry. The Bush 41, Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, library foundations and centers, especially our partners, Jim McGrath, Stephanie Street, Brian Casaboom, and Michael Stroutmantis. Thank you for your partnership and friendship. And then Dave Marchik, the director of the Center for Transition at the Partnership for Public Service, and my co-author now on this study of 10 transitions in crisis, which is available on the Miller Center website. We at the Miller Center want to thank the George and Judy Marcus and their Democracy Praxis Fund, which went into all of our work on this event. We couldn't do this great work without you and all of our supporters. And finally, thanks to all of you for watching this event and for playing the most important job in our democracy, that of an informed citizenry. So on behalf of all of my colleagues at the Miller Center who worked hard with the Center for Transition to pull this together, our big thanks to everyone.